Welcome to our weekly class called Nitzutzos, Sparks, Tidbits of the Parsha. Parsha's Chukas is an enigmatic one by design. The word chok, which is the root word, Chukas means the chok of, is a word in Hebrew that has two meanings, and the two meanings are interconnected. One meaning is a law. Chok is a law. Even today in modern Hebrew, chok would be a law. But it also comes from a word that means engraved. So we have a law that is engraved. Well, what does that mean? I mean, we use the expression etched in stone as a way of saying this is a real law that cannot be changed, cannot be budged. But even within laws themselves, there are different kinds of laws. There are laws that, though we can't change them because they're divine, like we're not going to change a law that a person should not kill someone or should not steal from someone, but because it's based on logic, then we could question it, we could analyze it, we could play around with it, as it were. But a law that doesn't have a rational explanation, because it transcends rationality, that is a law that is etched in stone, that is permanent. There's nothing you can do with it. You can't argue with it. You can't change it. You can't even challenge it, because whatever the challenge is, say, so what if it doesn't make any sense? It's not supposed to make sense. But also there's a deeper understanding. When you write something on a piece of paper, the ink is one thing, the paper is another thing. They're not really one. They become attached, but you could erase it, you could remove it. But if something is etched in stone, it's inseparable. There are commandments that are given to us by God, but they are not as unified with God and ultimately with us, with our souls that do it, as these commandments, the trans or supra-rational commandments. That's what a chok is. And what commandment are we talking about specifically? This is about the red cow. Everyone knows the significance of red cows. We don't know. That's one of the beauties of this, that we have no understanding. Why are we taking a red cow? But in the case, if a person touched a dead body, came in contact with a dead body, was in the same house, under the same roof as a dead body, that person becomes tameh. The word tameh has no English translation. You'll read translations that'll say unclean, impure, but they're not really accurate translations because there is no one word that can translate the word tameh. Tameh is a paragraph. Tameh means that a person who is called tameh is in a state where their expression of the divine that occurs through one's associated with life is curtailed. And therefore, one has to regain life, has to retreat, withdraw, and rediscover the energy, the life. That's what tameh means. That's a whole mouthful. It's not one word. Now, there are two ways a person can become tameh. One is through natural means, when a person goes to sleep at night, because the soul, the life force withdraws, the body is now considered tameh. It's in a state of curtailed life, and therefore the person, when he wakes up in the morning, we recite Moda Ani, we thank God, but then we wash our hands as a way of removing the so-called impurity. But it's not really impurity, it just means a state of curtailed life, and water is the symbol of life. That's why we wash our hands with water. Another example, when a woman gives birth. So she just gave birth to a living being which left her body. She's in a state of tameh. She has to now go through a period of rest, a lull, where she regains her spiritual energy. So it's a natural phenomenon. Person comes in contact with a dead body. You came in contact with something that is lifeless. You have to withdraw, reflect on life, and go through a purification process. There's another kind of tameh where it's generated by our actions. When we do something that is ungodly, we push God out of our existence, temporarily of course, so we become tamei. But there are all sorts of forms of tamei that require different kinds of purification processes. The process of the red cow is one in which you take a red cow, totally red, can't even have two black hairs, it has never been used, never been worked on, and the cow would be slaughtered outside the temple grounds. They would take the dead animal, they would burn the meat into ashes, they would dilute the ashes with spring water and take some plants, cedar and hyssop, and they would use that to sprinkle the water on a person who came in contact with the dead on the third day and on the seventh day, and then the person was allowed to enter the temple. How does this work? We have no way of knowing how it works because it doesn't have any rational basis. Not only does it have a rational basis, we can't explain why it works, how it works. There are many paradoxes. For example, the people who are engaged in preparing the red cow become tamei themselves. Not the same degree, they don't require the same purification process, but they do have to go through a purification process. So the enigma is, here they're purifying someone, and they themselves become in a state of tamei. We'll use the English word impure for the sake of brevity, so I shouldn't have to repeat a paragraph every time I mention the word. So that's one of the paradoxes. Another paradox is it's called a sacrifice, yet it is not done in the temple. So it's a contradiction in terms. It is a sacrifice, it is a divine ritual, but it would be executed outside the temple grounds. That's another one of the paradoxes. But then Rashi comes along after saying that it's a chok, that it's not rational, and he quotes Rav Moshe Hadarshan, one of the great rabbis who lived a little bit before Rashi, who says there's a very good reason for this. He says the Jews worshipped a golden calf. A calf is a young cow. So how do you atone for something that causes people to become impure through their sin? You bring the mother, the cow. The red cow is the mother who cleans up the mess of the child. A very beautiful metaphor. We messed up with a child, so the mother comes along and atones for it. It's a symbolic interpretation, but yet it does make sense. It's not a complete enigma anymore. So how do we explain the fact that it's called an enigma and yet Rashi gives an explanation for it? So one explanation for that is that the enigma is not that the person becomes purified through this. The enigma is the power of tshuva, the power of a person being able to change his or her status. When a person takes a knife and cuts a connection that you have to something else, that connection is severed. You can't put it together again. I mean, you take a knife and you cut the jugular of an animal, that animal is dead. That's it. It's finished. We have the power, no matter how much we sever our ties with God, we could correct it as if nothing ever happened. That's the power of tshuva. That's the mother. The mother, tshuva is the mother of all of our actions. It has the power to clean whatever it is that we did to make ourselves soiled. So that's the enigma. How could that be? How could that work? That's the enigma, that the mother could clean the child in the case of a person who sins, which is the cause of death in the first place. Why is there death in this world? Death is not the natural state of the world. When God created Adam and Eve, they were supposed to live forever. By eating of the forbidden fruit, they brought death into the world. So contrary to what everyone says, that there are two things that are inevitable, taxes and death, I would say taxes maybe, but not death. Death is a temporary phenomenon. It wasn't the way the world was created, and it's not the way the world will end, because in the Messianic age, when life, the dead will come back to life, that will usher in a period of eternal life. That's a subject that needs much more discussion. I know a lot of people will say, eternal life, I'll get so bored with life, I don't want to live forever. But that's because people have no understanding what real life is. In the Messianic age, we will understand the value of life not the relative value, which they call quality of life. We will understand the intrinsic and essential value of life. At any rate, death is a temporary phenomenon brought on by sin, and when the Jews got the Torah at Mount Sinai, that was going to reverse it. But the golden calf reversed the reversal. So when we bring the Parah Aduma, the red cow, the mother, tshuva, through repentance, we chip away at the reversal of the reversal, and we're restoring the world to its original integrity and bringing the world closer and closer to that time when death will be completely swallowed up. That's the biggest enigma, how that's possible. We can't humanly understand that, and that's why it's called a chok. A historical statement. In the introduction to this law, it says Zos, and this is chapter 19, verse 2, Zos Chukas HaTorah. This is the decree or the statute of the Torah. This is on page 839 in the Art Scroll edition. This is the decree of the Torah. Now the word chukas can translate in many ways, the law, the statute, but the translation in Hebrew, in Aramaic rather, from Unclus, the Aramaic translation is Da Gezeras Araisa. This is the decree of the Torah. Now, the word Gezerah, which translated as decree, could mean decree as in law. The government decreed that people should do this or that. But it also could be a decree, an edict that causes pain and harm to people, causes persecution and oppression. So when Jews talk about various oppressions, they call it the Gezerah of the 1648, 1649, the Gezerah of the Crusades, the Gezerah of the Holocaust. Well, what does it do with this Parsha? In the year 1244, in Paris, those Frenchies have never changed. I apologize to all the French people in our audience. My wife is also French. But in 1244, they took, I think it was 24 wagon loads of handwritten copies of the Talmud, and of Maimonides' works, and a bunch of other Jewish texts, and they burnt it. And the rabbis were so troubled by this that they felt they had to go higher to find out an answer to this question, why this happened, or what is this all about? And they inquired of God through a dream inquiry. That's a mystical approach, how you can find answers by writing down questions, putting it onto your pillow or something like that, going through a whole bunch of preparations, mystical experiences, and then in your dream you get the answer. And the answer was the three words of the Aramaic translation. This is the decree of the Torah. This was a decree that would cause the Torah to be burnt. And from that time onward, Jews fasted in that week. On a Wednesday, I think that's when it occurred, on a Wednesday of the week in which we read the Parsha of Chukas. Well, it's not a fast day, it's still around, but it was around for a while, I guess, for Jews who lived in that area. So that's based on this verse. The Rebbe points out an interesting thing. Last week we read Korach, the rebel. This week we read Chukas, commitment to God in ways that go beyond our understanding. It's fascinating that Korach and Chukas have the same, share two of the three letters. They both have a ches and a kuf. The difference is that Korach has a reish and Chukas has a taf. So the Rebbe explains that reish is a letter that means poverty. In Hebrew, there are many words for poverty. I guess when you live through Jewish history and you see the poverty, you can figure out why they have so many words, like the Eskimos have so many words for snow. Jews have a lot of words for poverty and for joy. We have a large dose of both. If we wouldn't have the joy, we couldn't endure the poverty. At any rate, reish or rush means poor. And Korach, in spite of the fact that he had such a high soul, chok, but he ended up being very poor because he didn't understand the importance of translating his high ideals into action. That's one of the biggest problems that people have. Simple people don't have that problem. It's sophisticated people that have the problem that they have brilliant theories, they have noble ideals, but somehow they don't translate it into action. That's what the left leg of the Reish doesn't have a left leg. That's the leg of action. They don't know how to translate their ideals into real life. The Tough, on the other hand, has that left leg, plus another protrusion, like a little yud. That means the tough person happens to be someone who takes the ideals to the end. Tough happens to be the last letter of the alphabet. Tough is also the initial of Tchias HaMeisim, the resurrection of the dead. In other words, the tough person is one, tough not T-O-U-G-H, but the letter Tav in Hebrew is the person who takes the ideals and translates it in action and takes it to its nth degree and does it with yud, with humility, which of course Korach was lacking. It's a fascinating story in the Talmud. I may have said this in one of the earlier classes, but it's a fascinating story and it has a connection to this week's Parsha of Chukas. The Talmud spends a few pages detailing the laws concerning honoring a parent. According to the Talmud, there's no greater mitzvah and no more difficult mitzvah than to honor a parent adequately. And there are many stories the Talmud tells about how people went to extremes and it wasn't enough. And the Talmud, to illustrate the degree to which one has to honor a parent, cites an example of a Roman official who lived in Israel. Israel was under Roman domination, so a lot of Roman officials lived in Israel. And this particular Roman guy, whose name was Dama ben Nisina, or Netina, he lived in the city of Ashkelon, that's southern Israel. And he displayed incredible respect for his father and mother. And the Talmud tells the story about how he respected his father. The rabbis who were in charge of the temple at that time realized that one of the 12 gems of the breastplate was missing. That was the yashpe stone, the jasper. So they had to look around to find a large enough stone that would be befitting for the high priest to wear. And they searched and they discovered that this Dhamma owned such a gem. So they came to him and they offered him, I think it was 100,000 coins of silver. And he said, no, I can't, because the key to the box in which the gem is kept is under my father's legs or under his pillow. There were different versions of that. And I can't wake him up now because he's sleeping. So come back later. And they sensed that he probably wanted more money. So they doubled. And he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't. They tripled. They quadrupled the amount. And when he still said no, they came to the conclusion that he doesn't really want to sell it. So what happens? They leave, and his father wakes up. He grabs the key, and he opens up and gets the gem, gets the jasper, and runs after them, catches up with them, and says, okay, I'll sell it to you now. Well, the rabbis, being the moral and ethical people they were, realized that they only offered 100,000 the first time, but in the end they offered 400,000, so they offered to pay him 400,000. He says, no, I want 100,000, the original amount that you were willing to pay. I don't want to get rewarded for honoring my father. So the Talmud says we should learn from this Roman.
Jewish Roman?
No, Roman. Yeah. Pagan Roman. How to honor one's father. Now, the story is a little bit surprising, but it doesn't end there. It's surprising that the Talmud would want us to learn lessons from a Roman official. You know what the Romans did to us? The Romans, second to the Nazis, committed the greatest amount of genocide in all of Jewish history. Estimates range up to 2 million Jews were murdered by the Romans, which was a higher percentage than that of the Holocaust. And they massacred people, they tortured people. They were horrible. There were some good ones as well. Maybe this Dhamma was a good one. But it's a little strange that we had to learn a lesson. But there's an expression that's quoted in many sources. We take the truth, learn the truth from wherever it comes. If this guy displayed incredible honor of his parents, that's great, and we should learn from him. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story was God does not remain in debt. Next year, a red heifer, a red cow, was born on his farm. And he sold it for the amount
300
that he had given up for the honor of his father, the extra 300. That's the end of the story. So God rewarded him that he got his money, he had his cake, he was able to eat it as well. He did the mitzvah, and he got the money. So the question is, if God wanted to reward him financially, there's so many ways God could have done it. Why did it have to come through a red cow? So the Chedushi Harim, the first Rebbe of the Ger dynasty, the largest Hasidic group in Poland, he lived in the 1900s. So he says the following. He says, whenever a non-Jew who did not get the Torah, did not have all the years of teaching, of so much divine inspiration that we had the temple in Jerusalem, we have such a history, a rich history of so much knowledge, so much sacrifice, of so much commitment, and all of a sudden a Roman official of all people who their whole life revolved around killing and pillaging and materialistic pursuits, pagan worship, and here he does something that was more noble, that we couldn't find a Jew who was able to do the same thing, that we have to learn a lesson from a Roman. That reflects very badly on the Jewish people. Whenever that happens, it's like God is saying to you, look what this guy has done, and what about you? And that's not good for us. So that's why God says, I want to tell you something. Yes, it's true. You did that great mitzvah, and I don't know too many Jews who would have sacrificed that much. But I want you to know that my children are even more noble, because they're willing to spend any amount of money for a dumb red cow because I said it's going to purify you. It makes no sense. Honoring parents makes a lot of sense. They gave us life. They gave us health. They gave us whatever we have. Good parents, even bad parents, give you life, and good parents give you everything. So it's quid pro quo. They gave us, we give them back, and that's fine. That's great. And you're willing to sacrifice money for that. It says, but my children, if I tell them to jump off the roof, they'll jump off the roof. And buying a red cow for 300,000 silver coins is like jumping off the roof. It makes no sense. But it's God's command, and they'll do it. There's a much deeper relationship that I have with them, even though I'm sometimes very upset with their behavior. They're lacking, but when it comes to, push comes to shove, they're very special people. The Torah begins this section with the words, after it says, this is the statute of the Torah, it talks about the red cow, and then it talks about a person in verse 14. Zos HaTorah, this is the teaching, Adam Kiyamus Ba'ohel, a person who would die in a tent. So anything who's in the tent becomes tameh, becomes ritually impure. For the sake of brevity, I'm just translating it that way. The Talmud has an interesting lesson that it learns from this, and it reads the words and translates them differently. This Torah, how does one acquire Torah? The person has to die in the tent. What does that mean? That when a person learns Torah, he has to be completely oblivious to the whole world around. He's like dead. He's just puts himself in the tent. Tent is a metaphor for the teachings of Torah, for the academy of Torah. Person has to die for Torah, not literally but figuratively. That's his whole life. Nothing else exists. And there's an interesting story attached to this teaching. In the 19th century, one of the greatest Talmudic minds was a rabbi by the name of Ephraim Zalman Margolis. Not only was he one of the greatest Talmudic scholars, and he wrote many books, classics, he was also one of the wealthiest bankers in Europe. So he was able to, he devoted much of his time to his banking, but the bulk of his time was studying Torah and writing his commentaries and his responsa. He had 2 hours every day when he would tell his wife, in those 2 hours, I don't want to be interrupted by anyone. He would spend a lot of time on his business when it was needed, but those 2 hours were sacrosanct. He would not allow his wife to interrupt him for anyone. If they want to meet with me, let them wait the 2 hours. And she did this for 20 or so years. One day, some bankers came to visit him, and they said, it's an emergency. We have to speak to him. And the wife said, I'm sorry, but he's studying Torah. He can't be interrupted. And they said, but can't you make an exception? Once, this is so urgent. And she says, I don't know. And I kept on telling her how urgent, so she let them in. And then after it was over, the husband came to her and said, we had a deal that you're not supposed to interrupt me. She said, yeah, but 20 years I haven't interrupted you. Obviously, this must have been so urgent. Couldn't you make an exception? Why are you upset? He says, what would have happened? He said, if I would have passed away this morning, and the same bankers come, and they said, we want to speak to Rabbi Margolis. And you would say, I'm sorry, but he's deceased. He said, but we have to see him. It's very important. He said, okay, I'll make an exception. If I'm dead, I'm dead. So that's what the Torah means, that you have to be dead in the tent, that you're as if you were dead. You can't make excuses. You can't make exceptions. That's how your devotion to Torah has to be. And the Rebbe would always, I don't think I've heard the story from the Rebbe, but the Rebbe would always talk about a concept based on ethics of the fathers. It says, establish times to learn Torah. Now the word in Hebrew has several meanings, but the real deeper meaning is that it doesn't make a difference how much time you study. It could be 12 hours a day, it could be 12 minutes a day. But whatever amount of time we have the ability to study Torah, we have to set aside times that it becomes fixed into our soul. It's so much a part of us. Nothing in the world, your wife, your business associates, important things, but those few minutes have to be sacrosanct, even if it's 2 minutes. But you have to be totally immersed in those 2 minutes, and preferably the longer, the better. Now, there's a law over here that if a person is in the same building as a dead body, they become tameh. They are ritually unclean. They are in a room under the same roof as a dead body. They didn't touch the dead body. They're just under the same roof. The Talmud records one opinion, Rabbi Shimon, who says that this only applies to a Jew who is dead. If you touch the body of a non-Jew, you become tameh. But if you're in the same building, it doesn't apply, because the Torah uses the word Adam. Whenever the Torah uses the word Adam, it's referring specifically to the Jewish people. So this was often used by anti-Semites as an accusation against Jews. Look, you don't consider us human. Well, there are many words in Hebrew for person which applies to Jews and non-Jews alike. But the word Adam applies specifically to the Jewish people. So there are two explanations that were given as to how this works. The word Adam, where does it come from? It has two sources. One source is Adamah. Adamah is earth. Adam came from the earth. The other source is Adameh le'elyon. I am like the one above. We are compared to the stars in heaven and the earth and the dust of the earth. What does that mean? That Jews uniquely are either in the stars, in the heavens, they're like the one above, or they're down in the ground, physically and spiritually. We don't have normal fluctuations. You know, every person in every nation has times when they get a little better, stronger, and they go down a little. It follows certain patterns, certain rules. We don't have those rules. We're either on top of the world or on the bottom of the world. That's what the word Adam means. Adam is uniquely a Jewish phenomenon, people who are either on the top or on the bottom. You know, just a little over a half century ago, we were at the bottom. You couldn't imagine being in a more desperate position than the Jews were in Europe, where 6 million were murdered, and if things had not gone awry for Hitler, it would have been much more than 6 million. We were on the bottom, and then all of a sudden, a few years later, Israel is considered to be one of the top and most advanced civilizations in the world, technologically, medically, in every area, including teaching of Torah. There are thousands of volumes of Torah commentaries published every year in Israel. I think in Jerusalem alone, I heard a statistic, 2,000 to 3,000 books are published every year in Jerusalem on Jewish subjects, on Torah subjects. So we have reached the pinnacle so shortly after we were on the ground. That's uniquely Adam. And that's why we're more susceptible to impurity. The non-Jew is not as susceptible to impurity because we can go very high, but we can also go very low. So we're more vulnerable. Then there's another explanation I once heard, and this goes back to the famous blood libel in Russia, Mendel Bayless, in the early 20th century, a little over a century ago. Mendel Bayless was accused of slaughtering a Christian child to use the blood for matzah, and there was a major trial in Kiev. This was an internationally publicized case, and miraculously he was acquitted, and he moved to America, Mendel Bayless. He was a simple, average Jew, but they picked on him because he lived not too far from where the body was found, and they made up some story about him. At any rate, the entire case was an anti-Semitic charge. Anyone who knew anything about Jews and Judaism knew that's the most frivolous, most ridiculous charge you could make. But they threw out all their anti-Semitic venom during this trial. And one of the questions they asked, how could you say that you don't hate Gentiles when you, in your Talmud, say that a non-Jew is not called Adam? So you are anti-non-Jew. So Rabbi Mazza, who was one of the rabbis there, got up to answer the question. He said, there are many words in Hebrew for person that can be written in the singular or in the plural. Enosh, anashim. Ish, ishim. Gever, gevarim. There's no plural for Adam. You don't say Adamim. Just one singular. He says, why is that? Because in all other places, in all other nations, if one person commits a crime, no one blames the entire nation and the entire culture. You know, we have rotten apples wherever you go. But if one Jew is accused of a crime, every Jew is accused. Because this trial is not about Mendel Bayless, it's about all of the Jewish people. That we all are a bunch of murderers. So that's why we're called Adam. There's no plural. Every Jew is recognized as the entire people, and the entire people as one Jew. Then we go to another subject. This is already closer to the end of the 40 years. Miriam, Moses' sister, the heroine of the whole story of the Exodus, passes away, and there's no more water. Because our sages tell us that the three major miracles they experienced in the desert, the manna from heaven, the water from a rock, and the clouds that surrounded them, came in the merit of Moses. The manna came in his merit. The water came in the merit of Miriam, and the clouds of glory in the merit of Aaron. When Miriam died, so did the water cease. So God and people complained. Believe it or not, Jews once in a while do complain. And Moses is told by God, take your staff and then speak to the rock. And Moses hits the rock and it produces water. And God gets angry at Moses and he says, you didn't sanctify my name, you're not going to enter the promised land. What was going on over here? This is such a hard thing to understand. It's such a sad thing that Moses, if you ask Moses, what is the greatest wish in your life? You know, what do you want more than anything else in the world? He would say, go to Israel. And here, the greatest person that ever lived, his greatest wish, God says, no. Why? No one understands why.
He hit a rock.
He hit a rock? I mean, I can think of bigger sins. You know, mass murder, for example, is a little bit bigger sin than hitting a rock. Okay, so the standard answer is God treats righteous people more harshly than the average. He takes them to task when they don't do everything 100% right. But that's not a satisfying answer. So Rashi gives his answer. Maimonides gives his answer. And there are a whole bunch of other answers, what he did wrong. The Or HaChaim, one of the great Sephardic commentators, gives 10 explanations what he did wrong. An Italian rabbi who wrote a commentary on the Torah was asked for his explanation. He says, I don't want to find more faults with Moses. Why do I have to look for more faults? But what does Rashi say? God wanted him to speak to the rock, and he hid it. So that alone doesn't sound like a terrible crime. And one of the explanations is that it wasn't a crime, but it was an act that demonstrated that Moses had to stay in the desert. That he was not ready to lead the new generation into the land of Israel. Because speaking to the rock and hitting it is a metaphor as well as an actual thing. When God took the Jews out of Egypt and there was no water, he told Moses to strike the rock. And here he tells Moses to take his staff with him. And according to the Midrash, he did speak to the rock and it didn't work. So he said, well, obviously if God told me to take my staff, and he once told me to hit the rock, and now it's not producing water by talking, that means I have to hit it. Where did he go wrong? What was the theme behind all this? We are like rocks sometimes. Our heart becomes hardened and we can't produce water, which is a symbol of life, symbol of that which nurtures us and gives us our support. Torah is likened to water. Sometimes we become so hardened that the only way we could express our inner soul's desire to do good, to serve God, is by tough love. Striking the rock when they came out of Egypt was necessary at that time because they had become so hardened by their ordeal as slaves in Egypt that the only way they could express the refreshing waters within themselves, they had to be hit. They needed tough love. 40 years later, we're living in a different era. The people no longer needed tough love. God says, speak to them. Didn't work. Well, Moses should have just kept on speaking. There was no need for the staff. The staff was there as contrast. We used to use this, but now we don't need this anymore. We expect you to be able to bring forth your water just by saying soft words to you. That's one explanation. Therefore, Moses was not punished that he didn't see the promised land. He just proved that he was not the one who could lead this new generation. he came from an earlier generation, and it needed young blood, so to speak, to take him into this. But then there's a midrash that says something very powerful. But this was all a pretext. God just orchestrated things in a way that he should make a mistake and hit the rock. But the truth is, God wanted Moses to stay in the desert because as a faithful leader, he had to stay with his people. And the midrash in this week's Torah portion says when Mashiach will come, Moses will arise before everyone else, and he will take his people into the land of Israel. His wish shall be granted. When a righteous person wants something, they get it. Not necessarily when they want to get it, but they get it. God does not withhold the wish of a righteous person. And the same thing is true with the Rebbe's wish and promise that we are the last generation of redemption. It has taken longer than what the Rebbe would have wanted, what everyone would have wanted, but he will get his wish. It will happen, and not in the distant future. Have a good week and a good Shabbos.